Okay, so I want you to understand something about the way power actually works in the post-Soviet space. When we look at what is happening in Moldova right now, we are not looking at some isolated border dispute or a regional squabble that belongs on page 6 of the international news cycle. We are looking at a masterclass in how a declining power uses frozen conflicts as instruments of statecraft. And more importantly, we are looking at how a small, determined leader in Maia Sandu is trying to break that pattern. I am Professor Jang, and this is where geopolitical analysis meets the machinery of history. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay locked in, because what happens in Moldova over the next 18 months will reshape the entire European security architecture. Let me start with the obvious question. Why does Putin care about Transnistria now? The answer is not complicated, but it requires you to think structurally. Moldova has been moving toward the European Union. That process accelerated dramatically under Sandu's leadership beginning in 2020. In March 2022, Moldova applied for EU membership. By June 2023, it received candidate status. In 2024, a referendum on EU accession passed with 50.17% voting yes. And here is what matters. The Copenhagen criteria, established in 1993, require that any candidate nation demonstrate stable democracy, a functioning market economy, and the capacity to implement EU law across its entire territory. That last phrase is the trap. You cannot apply EU law across your entire territory when a strategically significant chunk of it is de facto controlled by a foreign power. Transnistria is not just any territory. It is a 1,600 square mile strip on the left bank of the Dniester River. It is home to 1,500 Russian soldiers. It is home to the Cobasna ammunition depot, the largest in Eastern Europe, containing 22,000 tons of military equipment that has been there for anywhere from 35 to 75 years. And it is the mechanism by which Russia has for decades maintained leverage over Moldova without having to fire a shot. Okay, let me take you back to understand how this frozen conflict actually began. The story traces to 1989, when the Soviet Union began to collapse. Moldova declared sovereignty in 1990. But Transnistria, which had become the industrial hub of Moldova during Soviet times, opposed Moldovan nationalism. When Moldova passed a law enshrining Moldovan as the official language and replacing Cyrillic with Latin script, the Russian and Ukrainian minorities in Transnistria felt threatened. The elites who had grown powerful under Soviet rule saw power shifting westward and organized. In 1990, Transnistria declared itself an autonomous republic. A civil war broke out. And here is where Russia entered the picture permanently. The Soviet 14th Army, stationed in Transnistria, sided with the separatists. When Moldova tried to assert control over these troops, Russian President Boris Yeltsin transferred them to Russian Federation Command. The 14th Army then inflicted several key defeats on Moldovan forces. A peace accord was signed in July 1992, and for the next 34 years, nothing was resolved. The region remained frozen, controlled by Russian-aligned separatists, garrisoned by Russian troops, and effectively outside Moldovan authority. Now, for much of this period, Moldovan governments did not push hard on the issue. They swung between pro-Russian regimes and oligarch-controlled governments. Neither had incentive to close the chapter. But Sandu changed that calculation entirely. She came to power on an anti-corruption, pro-Western platform. She vigorously pursued EU and NATO integration, and she understood something crucial. The Transnistria issue was not just a historical relic. It was the single biggest impediment to Moldova's EU accession. Let me be clear about what this means. The EU has signaled that autonomous regions do not automatically disqualify membership. Cyprus joined with an ongoing territorial dispute. So did West Germany. But the Copenhagen criteria are strict, and the rules have tightened substantially since 1993. Moldova must demonstrate control and the capacity to implement EU law everywhere within its borders. As long as Transnistria is outside that control, Moldova cannot meet that requirement. So Sandu did something remarkable. She began tightening the economic noose. On January 1st, 2024, her government imposed taxes on imports and exports to and from Transnistria. The separatist leader Vadim Krasnoselsky called it an economic blockade. He was right. Coupled with energy supply disruptions after Russia stopped subsidizing gas, the move hit hard. In 2025, Transnistria's economy contracted by almost 18%. Industrial production fell 27.3%. Foreign trade turnover collapsed by 28.5%. Inflation shot to 14.7%. And then, on January 1st, 2026, Ukraine and Moldova coordinated even stricter border controls. Suddenly, the gray zone that Russia had managed quietly for decades became a controlled space where outside support became highly visible and easy to interdict. For years, Russian support for Transnistria moved through informal trade routes, friendly businesses, loose customs checks. By shutting those down, Sandu and Ukraine made Russia's presence harder to sustain and far less effective as leverage. Okay, now let me address what Putin did in response, because this is where the pattern becomes unmistakable. On May 13th, the Russian State Duma passed a law granting Putin authority to deploy Russian troops abroad to protect Russian citizens arrested or detained by foreign courts. Moscow does not recognize the Kyiv government as legitimate. It is not far from withdrawing recognition of Sandu's government either. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova made it explicit. Any aggression against Russian citizens in Transnistria will receive an immediate and adequate response. All necessary means. 2 days later, on May 15th, Putin passed a decree fast-tracking citizenship for Transnistrian residents. Residents over 18 can now obtain Russian citizenship without proving knowledge of Russian language, history, or law. They are exempt from the 5-year residency requirement. The move was framed as protecting rights and freedoms. But let me be transparent with you. This is not about protecting rights. This is about creating a legal pretext for military intervention. This is about saying we now have Russian citizens in Transnistria, and if Moldova moves against them, we have a doctrine to respond. Sandu rejected the framing immediately. She claimed Putin was attempting hidden mobilization of the local population to boost forces for the Ukraine war. She claimed Moscow was using the passport policy to exert political pressure on Chisinau as Moldova moves to reintegrate the region. And she stated that it would not work because the vast majority of Transnistrians want to be Moldovan and join the EU. In an interview with RFI and DW, she said, "I believe those who wanted Russian citizenship probably got it in the past, but I also do not see why people would want Russian citizenship these days. On the contrary, many people who did not have Moldovan passports have now obtained them. People want to be EU citizens, not Russian citizens." Now let me examine whether the facts back her up. According to the 2015 census, approximately 475,000 people live in Transnistria. At least 358,000 possess Moldovan citizenship. Around 220,000 have Russian citizenship. Another 100,000 or so have Ukrainian citizenship. So many hold multiple passports. Moldova allows dual citizenship, as does Transnistria. It is certainly true that applications for Moldovan passports from left bank residents are rising. More than 2,000 residents applied in 2025, a 50% increase from 2024. But here is where Sandu's narrative becomes more complicated. Between 2022 and 2023, the government reported 38,040 passports issued, suggesting a significant drop-off recently. Official statistics tell us that the vast majority of those with Moldovan citizenship received it before the Ukraine war started. While 2022 and 2023 saw a surge in applications, 330,538 residents, well over 90% of the current total, had already received Moldovan passports by the end of 2020. So the pull of EU membership is real, but the timeline is more nuanced than Sandu suggests. Let me address something directly. There is an element of farce in this entire affair. Romania has long offered expedited citizenship to Moldovans based on shared history and ancestry. Under Article 11 of Romanian law, Moldovans who can prove descent from Romanian or Bessarabian citizens are eligible for simplified Romanian citizenship. This process typically takes 2 to 3 years, with exemptions from residency and language requirements. By 2024, hundreds of thousands of Moldovans, more than a third of the population, had obtained Romanian passports this way, including Sandu herself. So Putin's fast-track citizenship decree is not unprecedented. It is geopolitically motivated, but not unique in form. The difference is intent. Romania is offering citizenship to people who share ethnic and historical ties. Putin is offering it to create a legal basis for military intervention in a neighboring country. Okay, now I want you to think about what this pattern actually represents. Let me take you back to Georgia in 2008. Russia used frozen conflicts in South Ossetia and Abkhazia as justification for military intervention. In 2014, Russia used the protection of Russian-speaking populations in Crimea and eastern Ukraine as justification for invasion. The playbook is consistent. Create a separatist region, station troops there, maintain the conflict indefinitely, then, when political pressure mounts, use the protection of Russian citizens as legal cover for military action. What Putin is doing in Transnistria right now is setting up that same mechanism. He is creating a legal framework, a doctrine, and a pretext. Whether he will use it depends on whether Sandu continues to tighten the noose around Transnistria's economy. The strategic calculation is clear. If Sandu succeeds in economically strangling Transnistria and integrating it back into Moldova, Russia loses a crucial leverage point against EU expansion in the post-Soviet space. If Putin can trigger a crisis that forces international intervention or freezes Moldova's EU accession process, he wins. The Transnistria issue becomes the mechanism by which Russia delays Moldova's integration indefinitely. We have seen this story before in Georgia and Ukraine. Now Russia is using the same tactic against Moldova. But here is what makes this moment different. Sandu is not a pro-Russian oligarch. She is not a weak leader willing to compromise with Moscow. She has shown that her bite is much nastier than her bark. Moldova is constitutionally required to remain neutral. Changing that status requires a national referendum. A June 2023 poll showed 28% would vote for NATO accession, while 60.3% would vote against. So Sandu cannot overtly breach neutrality by supplying military aid to Ukraine or allowing Ukrainian forces into Moldova. But she has been a fervent supporter of Ukraine, and she has coordinated with Kyiv to tighten the economic blockade on Transnistria. That coordination is the key. Ukraine and Moldova are no longer treating Transnistria as a frozen conflict to be managed. They are treating it as a space to be contested and controlled. Okay, let me bring this all together. What we are witnessing is not just a regional dispute. We are witnessing a fundamental challenge to the way Russia has managed post-Soviet space for 3 decades. The frozen conflict model, which worked so effectively from 1992 to 2022, is breaking down. Economic pressure, coordinated blockade, and the pull of EU integration are making it harder for Russia to sustain control over these territories. Putin's fast-track citizenship decree is a sign of desperation, not strength. It is an attempt to reassert control through legal pretext because the old mechanisms are failing. If Sandu continues on her current trajectory, if Ukraine continues to support the blockade, if the EU continues to signal that Moldova has a path to membership, even with Transnistria unresolved, then Russia's leverage in this region will diminish substantially. But I want to be clear, I am not predicting that Putin will not act. The fast-track citizenship law and the new doctrine on protecting Russian citizens abroad are preparation for potential military intervention. The question is not whether Putin has the capability to intervene. He does. The question is whether the cost of intervention, given the current situation in Ukraine, is worth the benefit. That calculation is changing by the month as Ukraine's military situation stabilizes or improves, as Western military aid continues, as Moldova's economy becomes more integrated with Europe, the cost-benefit analysis for Putin shifts. Intervention in Moldova becomes less attractive, not because Putin has changed his nature, but because the strategic environment has changed. What happens next depends on three variables. First, how long can Sandu maintain the economic blockade without triggering a humanitarian crisis that forces international intervention? Second, how much longer can Ukraine sustain its own military effort while coordinating pressure on Transnistria? Third, how quickly can Moldova meet the Copenhagen criteria for EU accession? If Sandu can navigate these three variables successfully, Moldova has a genuine path to EU membership. The Transnistria issue may not be fully resolved, but it may become manageable. If any of these variables fails, Russia maintains leverage and the situation escalates. The stakes are enormous. Moldova is the poorest country in Europe. It has an economy roughly the size of a mid-sized American city. But its geopolitical position is crucial. It sits between Ukraine and the EU. What happens to Moldova will signal to other post-Soviet states whether the pull of Western integration is stronger than the pressure of Russian coercion. It will signal whether frozen conflicts can be overcome through economic pressure and coordinated strategy. It will signal whether the post-Cold War order in Eastern Europe is genuinely changing or merely being rearranged. I am Professor Jiang. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and watch Moldova very closely, because the future of Eastern European security is being decided right now in a small, poor country that most people have never heard of.